Thank you, Ferdy, for the introduction and the opportunity to share some of our outlook work with you today. And please excuse my voice here. So as you heard from Julian, the weather was horrible in Europe in recent weeks. So yes, as Ferdy said, I would like to talk about where we see global and African agriculture in the next decade and how these relate to the Sustainable Development Goals. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted by all UN nation member states in 2015. It's a universal call to action and provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. Out of the 17 goals, agriculture contributes most of all to SDG 2, to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. But the sector also has to consider SDG 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. The key challenge is, of course, to overcome the apparent trade-offs between more production and fewer emissions. There are immense challenges to achieve these targets. So, assuming on-trend technology, consumer preferences and policies, and using current macroeconomic expectations, our outlook projections suggest that without additional efforts, zero hunger will not be achievable by 2030, and agricultural greenhouse gas emissions will increase further. Here, you see two indicators to illustrate the challenges: undernourishment and the emissions intensity. So, globally, there were about 716 million people undernourished in 2022, 210 million of them in sub-Saharan Africa. The baseline projections shown, shown up here, right, indicate that globally we're on the right track. Now it's going slightly down, and that's mostly on the account of Asia here. But we're way too slow. And so there's still about 600 million undernourished here in 2030 and about 215 million of them in sub-Saharan Africa. So the line here is slightly increasing. So globally on the right track, but overall way too slow, and in sub-Saharan Africa even going the wrong way. Now, regarding the emissions target, a Tier 1 assessment, which assumes constant emission factors, projects that we have overall a decrease in the emission intensity in all regions. But still, we have an overall increase in total emissions over the coming decade. And showing this for sub-Saharan Africa, the Near East, North Africa, Latin America, here you have production growth and emissions growth. And you see the intensity is going down for all regions. So production outgrows emissions, but sub-Saharan Africa here still has quite a high level, so the highest of all the major regions, and as it accounts for about 17% of the emissions, but only 7% of production in 2031. Now, I also would like to point out that these assumptions are subject to uncertainty, of course. This example shows the sensitivity to fertilizer prices, which have been a concern, in recent years. So what we did here, we increased the price of fertilizer in our model by 25% in 2032, and we simulated that about 30% of that will be passed through to agricultural prices, and the chart here shows the various price increases of the crops in the region of sub-Saharan Africa. So on average, it's here about 7%, so about 30% being passed through. So that increase would squeeze farmers' margins and reduce food consumption, and as a result of that, undernourishment would also increase, and we estimated about 3.5 million people increase in 2032. Now, so under the baseline assumptions, we're obviously way off track for the SDGs. So I now would like to discuss a scenario that we simulated where we would eliminate hunger and put the sector on track of the 2015 Paris Agreement in 2030, using only agricultural productivity as the instrument to overcome the trade-offs. So in this scenario, we define zero hunger as a prevalence of undernourishment below 2.5%, and the emissions target is a reduction of 6% of direct emissions compared to global levels. Now, looking at the nutrition side first, showing again Sub-Saharan Africa and other developing regions for reference. So on the very left here, you see the baseline assumption for 2030. So that means that's the baseline. So, and this is about an 8% growth. So this is the normal baseline assumption. But if you want to have zero hunger, you need to go here. So 25% above this one. So significantly higher and the highest required growth of all regions. So you see there, fewer increases required here. And so just to explain that a little bit, so for simplicity, we assumed that this food will be affordable to all, and the calorie distribution within a country, which tends to be very uneven in Africa, would remain the same as it is in the baseline. But we assume that a growing share of more nutritious food, especially from animal sources, will come in, which also means more feed. That's important then for the production side. And we also assumed that consumption in food-secure countries, which has a lot of excess consumption, will also remain the same. Now, looking at the production response to that, again, the same sort of setup here. You have the current, then the base, and then the zero hunger scenario. And you see there, the baseline foresees about 11% production growth. Globally, so this is Sub-Saharan Africa, but globally, about 11% growth and 61% to achieve the zero hunger. So, and based on our assumptions, we assume that most of the growth would come in the countries where the increase in consumption would be located, so low and middle income countries. And this is then reflected here in the chart that for Sub-Saharan Africa, the baseline increase here is about 19%, but it would have to double to achieve zero hunger, right? Is that clear? So, this is target one, providing enough food to eliminate hunger. But remember, even under baseline conditions, emissions would increase already. So imagine where they would go if we have that type of production. And the objective, as I said, of the scenario is to find out what level of productivity would it take to get them actually down. And that's a summary for the global level now here. So before we go again to the regions. So that shows that globally we need a 28% increase over the current levels by 2030. And specifically about a 24% increase in yields. And for reference, in the last decade, they grew about 13%. And the global animal productivity, which is the main source of emissions from agriculture, the livestock sector would increase by 31%. And in the last decade, it hardly increased its productivity at all. Now, looking again at the levels that we would envisage for Sub-Saharan Africa under baseline and the scenario. Under baseline assumptions, yield grow between 10 and 20% to 2030 from mostly low levels. This still means some closing of the gap with more productive regions. Also, fertilizer use is projected to increase, but as we also heard before, efforts are constrained by limited use of inputs, irrigation infrastructure. But achieving the SDGs would mean to increase yields by about 25 to 90%. Which is necessary to enable the decoupling of crop production growth and land use change, right? So strong improvements are especially required here in in wheat, rice, and pulses, which are food crops that are consumed, especially as you get to higher level, and they're heavily dependent on imports in the region. So, because as I said, we wanted to assume a predominantly domestic production response. Now looking at the livestock side of things, again, in the baseline, the livestock production in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to increase by 27% over the decade based on herd expansions and productivity improvements. And that's shown here. So you have production and you have herd improvement. So and the difference is the productivity improvement. So in the baseline, there's everywhere some productivity improvement, but also everywhere some herd improvement. So, but compared to that, meat production would have to double, and milk production needs to increase by 145% in the zero hunger. So, right? So, it would mean 100% doubling here to fulfill the livestock demand. But as I said, it's a key source of emissions. So, to get the emissions down, you have to drastically reduce the herd. So, that level of production will have to be achieved with fewer animals, as you see in that level, in that yellow bar here. So just to get that down. So it would be a tremendous transformation that be required. Now a quick look at trade. So under the baseline assumptions here, sub-Saharan Africa is expected to rely progressively on imports to supplement basic food production. So it's estimated an increase here about 77%. But then for the zero hunger, as I said, we shifted a lot of that back into regional production rather than relying a lot on imports here. So let me just sum this up. So over the decade, agriculture and fish production in sub-Saharan Africa is projected to expand by 24%. That's the fastest of all major regions, but still the value of production per capita is expected to decline further. Total calorie availability per capita for food is lowest in the world, and stubbornly high inflation and a slow recovery in income levels implies that gains will be slow. As just seen, region trade deficit is expected to deepen. And regarding the scenario, we would clearly say that it requires really a comprehensive global effort and transformation that involves reduce of poverty, increase of agriculture productivity, as we just shown, but also additional measures, right? So like to mitigate agricultural greenhouse gas emissions directly through technology, equalize food consumption within countries, so work on the distribution, limit the excess calorie and protein intake in higher income countries, and reduce food loss and waste. So clearly, if the scenario showed anything, it's that technology alone will not be sufficient, and we need to face these often uncomfortable debates about, eating less, eating differently, wasting less, and producing differently. And yeah, and from an FAO point of view, our role is to support this debate and transformation, and we're looking forward to working with all of us with you, sorry. And that's it. Sorry.